See, I go back much further now than a lot of the people you'll have been interviewing. So some of the questions, but you'll see that when you answer them.
Grand. So usually you'll just start by sort of asking what the connection is to the language and how you came to...
Yeah. Well, Irish was the language I was brought up with, and I spoke Irish, but I was born in 1942, so I'm 80 years of age. So in the 40s, there are a number of these questions. For example, the Gaelscoil movement didn't exist, but all the national schools, in theory, were teaching through the medium of Irish. So in a way, that's your second question. I did go to primary schools where, in theory, they were teaching through Irish, but we were living in Cavan. Drogheda, Cavan were my two primary school areas, and of course there wasn't much Irish in Cavan. So we were an Irish-speaking family in an English. We were an Irish-speaking ghetto in an English-speaking area, and there wasn't that much Irish in my primary school. But I did go to a secondary school, which was an A school. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the secondary schools in Ireland at that time in the 50s could be an A school where they got an extra grant for teaching entirely through Irish. So I went to a secondary school which taught entirely through Irish. It was an A school. So I suppose it was the equivalent of a Gaelscoil today.
Where was that? Exactly?
It was a convent in County Longford, Ballymahan, County Longford.
Oh, right.
But so again, in the middle of a totally English-speaking area, but a lot of the Mercy schools applied for A school status to get the extra grant so that they could provide cheaper education. There was no free education, you see.
Secondary school was all fee paying at that time.
It was all fee paying. I got a scholarship to go to that school. It was I was a boarder there. I got a county council scholarship, and I chose to go there because it was an Irish-speaking school and because we spoke Irish at home.
Right. How did that come to happen? That your parents, was it one parent or both? Or?
Well, I was looking at that for why did we speak Irish? My father was a teacher. Initially, he was trained in St. Pat's in Drumcondra back in the 30s. His mother was in Conran na Gaeilge in 1904. I have a photo of her in Conran na Gaeilge. And my mother, you see, they were born in the second decade of the 20th century, so 1913, 1914. And so they were most Irish, they would have been kind of in a nationalist tradition as we came up to 1922, Free State, to the Free State. But they were both, when they met, they would have met through Conran na Gaeilge dances. And my father, when he went to Pat's in the 1920s, it was an entirely Irish-speaking environment there, and he met a lot of Gaelic people and genuinely got very interested in the language. And so when he qualified in the early 30s as a primary school teacher, he was very interested in the Irish language. He's written about it, and I have some articles that he wrote about why he got interested. So when my parents got married in mid-1930s, although my mother came from Bandon in West Cork, where she didn't have much Irish, I recently found that she did, in fact, in 1930, got, surprisingly, she was in her mid-teens, she got a certificate in Irish from the Conran na Gaeilge. So she obviously was interested in Irish as well. So both my parents were just interested, but they both came from English-speaking families, but they were interested in the Irish language. And when they got married, they decided they would bring up their children speaking Irish. And my mother, of course, there were 13 of us, so there wasn't, need I say, she never worked outside the home. And I had 10 brothers and sisters younger than me. So we had to get scholarships, either if we didn't, we all worked. The Irish language did help us, actually, because, well, first of all, we were Irish language speakers, but because it meant when we did the primary scholarships in those days, you had the primary cert and you had the scholarship exam when you went to 7th class. And if you got the scholarship, you could get into a secondary school and not have to pay fees. Right. So it was very important, in a big family like ours, to get the scholarship. So so that was my background. My father then became an inspector. And then, I don't know if you were at my talk, but he wrote the Buntus Kainte. So he was very active in the Irish, in the sort of cultural Irish language movement. But to go to your next question, we growing up, oddly enough, were never involved with Irish language or cultural organisations, partly because there were so many of us and we were so busy rearing each other. And so we didn't belong to Glór na Gael or Conor na Gael or Comhaltas Ceoltóirí or anything like that. Although as a very small child, my father would have, when there were only 7 or 8 of us in family, we were still going to the feshes. Feis na Bóinne was a big one. My father would have been on the... And in fact, I think my father was involved in Conor na Gaeilge in County Louth and County Meath, and also in Feis na Bóinne, which would have been a Conor na Gaeilge organisation. But personally, I was never involved. Not because I wasn't interested, just because we just looked after the other kids, you know. We didn't do anything like that. So, and then later on, I never got involved either. Well, I was involved in what was it? In Cumann Ashling, a walking organisation that may have had a connection with Crevicating. You know, Crevicating were one of the craves of Conor na Gaeilge. So when I was a teenager, I was involved in an Irish language walking group, which was involved with Crevicating, which was part of Conor na Gaeilge.
And you went from the A school then into the 3rd level at some point?
I went straight into Carysford to train as a national teacher, but I only lasted 3 months there, and then I got, again, because there were so many of us in family, I got a job in the Department of Education. So I left teacher training and went into an Áine docket. Because I was Irish speaking, when I got the civil service exam, those of us who were good at Irish went into the department, because at that time the Department of Education was a bilingual organisation, and we had to be able to do all our work to Conor na Gaeilge, which I was able to do. So I worked in the department from 1959 to 1965, when I got married. I met my husband, my late husband Bill, and he was working in the department. So I worked there and was very familiar with all the, you know, how it operated and how education was administered. And it was only after I got married and my children were very small that I went back to college at night and did my degree, did my HDip, and became a secondary teacher. But that was after I was married.
And what could you say about the culture of the department, maybe between 59 and 65?
Well, we did speak Irish. We spoke Irish a lot. It was a very conservative department, I suppose, looking back at it from today, looking at it from today's eyes. I mean, when I went in first, I genuinely did believe that the Irish education system was the best system in the world, looking back on it now and looking at the reports. But again, that was what we believed, and we still believed that the Irish language could be restored as the main language of the country. And like 1959 was when the Caidan came in. And the Caidan suited me because I was not a native Irish speaker. That was one of my problems in UCD. I did Irish in UCD, but I did very badly there because the then professor was only interested in people who had a real connuent. Blas and a connuent, and I didn't. And he hated those of us who were coming with what nowadays they'd call the Gaeilge Líofa. And because of that, it put me off Irish, although I was an Irish teacher. But it's only, oddly enough, in more recent decades that I've come back to Irish, because I was made to feel that my Irish was not good enough to hold conversations with real Irish speakers. Even though I had never spoken anything except Irish as a child. I knew no English at all until I was 7 or 8 years of age. I had to learn my catechism in English, but I didn't understand a word of it because I didn't understand English.
What professor was that?
Professor de Valdre.
The folklore.
An awful snob. An awful Gaeilge snob, yeah. And then he particularly didn't like, when my father then got involved in Buntus Kainte, he didn't like my father's work because my father wasn't a scholar, a true scholar, and as he saw it, although my father was a true scholar, he wasn't. Again, you know, he didn't have a master's, he didn't have a PhD or anything like that, but he was passionately committed to the Irish language. And his work, looking back on it, it's a really good piece of research, which he did with others at that time. But Dubaldra dismissed it, you know. Anyway, that's the past.
Right, and
So,
just in the department still, there were big changes happening
there
there in the
were,
early
because
60s in terms
my
of...
late husband was one of the people who was Bill was very involved in those changes. He came back from, his parents were both teachers in North Cork, but he was much older than me, but he came back from the UN. He'd been 10 years working abroad, working with the UN and with international agencies. And he was really looking at Ireland and Ireland's education system through a different lens altogether. And he was particularly looking at it from a social justice lens. He was very passionate about the lack of social justice. The fact that some of our high-ups in the department could sit and congratulate each other on how well they were doing. And I remember Liam Lane, who was the Secretary General when I was there, or later even, I remember sitting at a lecture and even Terry Rafferty, who was very good in other ways, but I remember them saying, this system was good enough for us. Look at where we got. You know, we got scholarships and we managed to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps.
Ideology, like,
It was an ideology, and that was a very strong ideology. The ideology that you could, in fact, that it was a meritocracy, but it wasn't a meritocracy. Yes, secondary education was not free, so it wasn't a meritocracy. Okay, there were a handful of scholarships that people like myself benefited from because my parents were interested in education, even though we were a large family, but they were very interested in education. But like for most, like neighbours of ours who, in Cavan, who, you know, whose boys had to leave school at 11 to be messenger boys or to whatever, there was no way it was a meritocracy for them. You know, and I've met lots of them since who, in spite of the system, managed. But so that was the issue back very much in the 60s. So Bill was a statistician, and what he did, I mean, it's worth having a quick look at a summary of I'll send you one of the article I wrote, because I summarised it, a retrospective on the investment education report, how I met Bill. Suddenly, like, he opened a whole new world to me, a world where there was an enormous difference between the social classes. Like, even as a teacher, you were in a different you were in a professional social class, you weren't, and the sort of, what would you call it, the treatment, I suppose, that was meted out to those who were not of that social class was pretty horrifying, to be honest, looking back on it. And even then, like, I was very torn then, because I had been brought up to believe that if I worked hard enough, you know, you would succeed. And we did. All 13 of us, thank God. 10 of us went to university. Nine of us have PhDs. So, like, but that was the ethos I grew up with. And it was only when I met my husband, well, he wasn't my husband then, my boyfriend, that he opened my eyes to the social injustices that existed. And they were very significant. The statistics of that report, 65, I have, I mean, there's some of them are in my paper. The proportion of young people who were early school leavers was 11, 12, 13, 14. We're not even talking about early, as we know it today. Only less than half of, 45% of an age cohort went as far as group cert or intercert, in other words, junior cert. Only about 20% of the total cohort got as far as leaving cert, and 5% went to higher education. So, like, Bill wasn't allowed to say anything, but he could provide the statistics, and the statistics were damning. And that was how free education was introduced. But even then, and Bill had come back to the department as a statistician at that stage, and he argued very trenchantly to not just to bring in free education, but to reimburse the poorer families for the opportunity costs, which is what I don't know if you're familiar with the concept. Opportunity cost is if you have a 12-year-old boy who could have gone out as a messenger boy and earned £5 a week to bring back into the home, but now he's staying on at school. Bill argued that the department and the government should also reimburse those families for the lost opportunity costs. But he lost that argument. And there's a guy called Brian Fleming who's written a very good book that's worth reading. I'll give you the name of it before you go. But he points out that without that, it has continued, like well into the 80s, 90s and even the noughties, difficult for some families to keep their kids in school.
Or they leave after the junior
Or
cert.
they leave after junior cert. And in particular, we now know that higher education, because the grants didn't keep up with the cost of living, basically. A lot of young people who manage to get in, they can't stay because they can't. So that's the opportunity cost, in other words. So anyway, I don't know how that.
Yeah, no, brilliant.
I'm off the topic now.
After the department, then you went. Is it then that you went to UCD?
Yeah. Well, I had started the BA in the evening before when I was in the department, but oddly enough, there was. The culture you asked me about the culture of the department. It was anti-educational, and it was very strange because the young people like myself, who wanted to go, who sort of would like to better ourselves and get a degree. Like I have no degree now, you see. So remember, I had just gone in with my leaving cert, but you had to not talk about that. So and there were a few of us doing degrees at night. But you wouldn't want anyone to know you were doing the degree. You see, most of our bosses wouldn't have had a degree. The Department of Education at the time was one of the few education departments that didn't recruit graduates. It only recruited people from leaving cert, and they all went up, they promoted. It was all internal promotion.
Yeah. I read that the civil service was quite like that broad.
A lot of it, but there were some departments, like finance had graduates. Department of Finance had graduates, and obviously Foreign Affairs always had graduates. But a lot of the departments, like education and social welfare and that, they didn't have graduates, so, and I would have been one of those. So when I got married, Bill by that stage had returned to the United Nations, but this time he was in Geneva. So I went out to Geneva, got a job with the International Labour Organization, which also opened my eyes to slightly different inequalities, because we were collecting statistics from places like South Africa, which didn't even count coloured people in their statistics. Their returns, I was amazed. South Africa had only, forget how many, 2 million people or something, when we had 4 million. And then, of course, it transpired they never even counted them as human beings in the statistics. So I learned a lot there as well. And then we got married out there, and my first daughter was born there. I came back. Now, remember, there was a marriage ban here, so I couldn't have gone back into the civil service. So I was now caught forever, as I saw it then. Women could never ever go back to the civil service. That was the 1960s rule, you see. It had been the rule since the 30s. So from the day I got married, as far as I was concerned, I knew I wouldn't be able to go back into the civil service. So they had begun to lift the marriage ban for teaching, although not completely. And I thought, since Bill was older than me, I thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a qualification of some kind. So that's why I did the degree in UCD in Irish and French and English. An evening degree, you could just do a pass degree, you weren't allowed to do an honours degree. And then I did my HDip in Trinity, because they were much more open and welcoming of kind of unusual people, non-mainstream people. And I did my HDip there, did very well on that, and I got funding out of that to do a master's and a PhD from Trinity at the time. But all of it was part-time. I was never a full-time student. I only told them that in UCC when I was retiring. I decided I wasn't going to tell anybody that. It wasn't none of their business, because they would look down on you see.
Yeah, they would.
So I was never a full-time student.
They sort of still do, or if you're an independent scholar.
Yeah, exactly. If you're doing
aligned to the
right.
institution and so forth.
So that was how I did. And then I did secondary teaching for about 7 years, taught Irish. I taught in Protestant schools, partly because I was involved in setting up the Dorky School project, so I was persona non grata with the Catholic Church a bit. I knew, but there was a lovely nun in Carysford College, which was a training college for women, and she asked me to do part-time tutorial work, which I did, and I loved that. But I tried a few times to get a job there, a full-time job, because by this stage I nearly had my PhD, you see, and I really liked third level work. But it took a long time before I got that job. Each time there'd be priests from, like the patron of Carysford, manager of Carysford College was the Archbishop of Dublin, and he'd have 2 nominees on the interview board, you know, so they'd ask me all kinds of questions, and I knew I was finished. But she eventually managed to get me a job, and ironically, where she couldn't get me a very junior job, I was appointed in 1980. Now my girls were growing up, I had 3 daughters by then, they were growing up in school, so I was a bit freer then to take a full-time job, and I was appointed a senior lecturer in Carysford, but with also responsibility for admissions. And that was a lovely, I was there for about 7 years, and then the college was closed. Then I got a job in UCD. We were kind of redeployed to UCD. Some of us, we were redeployed all over the place. But we were not very well treated in UCD because we were seen as kind of second class citizens. And so I then applied for the professorship in Cork in 1993 and got the professorship, and I was appointed vice president of the university in 1999. And I was there till I retired in 2006, and then I came back here.
So that's what brought you to Cork then,
Carysford
closed, UCD
Carysford
was
closed,
sort of
UCD,
hostile.
yeah, UCD wasn't particularly welcoming of us. They accepted us. We were there for I was there for a few years, and I loved the teaching part of it, but we had been, our union, I was a member of IFOT, they'd done a very good job at least getting us jobs, because they wanted, Carysford, or the department just wanted to get rid of us. They didn't think that we'd any right to redeployment, but it turned out that the convent, that the nuns and the bishop hadn't paid our PRSI, which was great, and we had no PRSI entitlement, so we couldn't get unemployment benefit. And I think it was to avoid a public scandal.
So they found jobs for you then.
They found jobs for us. Yeah. So I got the job in UCD. But I was an outsider there. We weren't allowed to apply for internal promotions, for example. That was one of the conditions. The union, we had to agree it because the alternative was not getting anything. Yeah. So, but we could apply obviously for new posts anywhere else, and that's when I applied to Cork and got it.
And did you go and live in Cork?
Yeah, well, Bill was retired by then. As I told you, he was 18 years older than me, and he had just retired from the Department of Education. And ironically, he was originally a Cork man. I wasn't. So my girls had grown up. They were going their own way, except for my youngest daughter, who was still in college. And yeah, well, you know, it was a good job. I mean, to get a professorship, especially when I wasn't, like UCD, I was kind of in a dead end there, really. And it was great, really. Although Bill, unfortunately, the year I went there, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he only lived for 3 years. So the first 3 years was very, very tough in Cork. I was there knowing nobody, because I'm not from Cork, I'm from this part of the world. But anyway, I survived. He died in 96, and then I stayed on for another 10 years.
Right. So during all that, the people in Ungortalen approached you?
Yeah, that's what happened, exactly. I went down in 93, and they were in the process, they were already negotiating, discussing with Educate Together, and I was chair of Educate Together. Partly, you see, because we were not really there wasn't that much happening in UCD. I had time then to get involved in Educate Together, and that was the period during which I took on the chair of the organisation and encouraged a number of the schools to get started at that time. And Gaelscoil and Gortaling contacted me and asked me to go on the board. So I was on that first board, but like it was in the middle of a whole lot of, I never missed a meeting, but I wasn't active there in the way I was active in Dalkey, like where I really was behind it. I draft all the letters. I never had to do that. we had temporary we had promised, you see, at that time, a school had to have its own, had to find temporary premises, had to find all the local contributions that they were required. In theory, they were supposed to find a site, but by 1993, the department wasn't as strict about that, but they had to find a temporary premises. So we were initially in a nursing home building, as I remember. It was very tough on the teachers and on the principal. And so while I was on it for that first few years, that's where we were, in very temporary accommodation. And we had, the other difficulties we had related to the policies, like the policies of Educate Together, the religious education policies. None of them had been translated. None of them had, like, while the founder, remember, what did you call his name? Owen O'Leary? No?
Owen O'Leary,
Yeah. Owen was very committed to it, but a lot of the parents who thought of it just as a Catholic Gaelscoil, because all the Gaelscoil up to then were Catholic, and they had Catholic instruction within school hours. We, Gaelscoil and Gardáling was trying to kind of bridge both those who wanted Catholic instruction within school hours and those who didn't. So we had a lot of debate about that. And the religious education core curriculum, which I had helped the Dublin-based English-speaking teachers to develop, and we had documents for that. We had in Educate Together, we didn't have anything in Irish, nothing at all in Irish. And the concepts, multi-denominational concepts and integrated education, like the religious education core issues, were very complex, and there wasn't even a vocabulary for them in English, and we had no access to anything like that, and the teachers hadn't.
Was this about really whether it should be instructed within the class and or in the free time and all of this?
We did agree at the beginning to have some of the Catholic instruction within school hours, but the core religious education curriculum, which was for everybody, was not. It was not. Faith formation is the word they use nowadays. We use words like indoctrination, but I'm not going to use those words. Faith formation was not part of the religious education core curriculum. Broadly, there were sort of moral and ethical issues that we all agreed on. There were personal development issues. It was like a bit like almost a personal development thing, and we did some comparative religion. We did, of course, recognise feast days, but there was no expectation that anybody believed in them. This was, we taught about them, but we did not require people to belong to those religions, to any of the religions. So that was the core, that's the religious education core curriculum at that time. And I had worked a lot on that, and I had a lot of documentation on it in English, but nothing in Irish. And
so did they just then translate that, or did they build
They tried,
their own?
in fairness to the teachers, no, they did. They tried to work on that, to use that as best they could. But like, we were able to use, say, some storybooks from the UK, British or Northern Ireland, which had a lot of English-speaking countries at that time would have had comparative education, very simple books for Rang a Tree, Rang a Cahar, Rang a Cuig. But of course we'd not, and so the English-speaking Educate Together schools could use those, not as textbooks, but as sort of reference resources. But we'd nothing in Irish at all, and that was hard for them. And then there were a few rows about, I know what happened then. We got transported. When Mary O'Rourke became minister, she allowed schools to have transport. I think we had the First Communion and Confirmation class. In the beginning, we only had Ninon, so there was no problem when we had Ninon. It was when it came up to Ranghain, which was then First Communion, and then they would needed extra preparation time. They'd have that after school hours. But then the school buses, when we became entitled, we weren't originally entitled to free transport, the way people who were coming in from the country. Then when the buses were coming in, when they were allowed to go on the school buses, they had to finish, they couldn't do outside school hours work. So there were lots of those issues. And then throughout...
Just practical issues, really.
They were all practical issues, yeah. There wasn't much in the line of ideological issues. we never had any ideological issues about the language or any of the, we were involved. The GAA, I think, afterwards gave them, I think they got prefabs then on a GAA site on near a football field. I think that's where they went after. Oh, it was terrible in that nursing home. You'd go in and it was clearly a nursing home, not a school, and there were lots of, for the teachers it was tough going, and there was no real playground. So, it's all right to be idealistic in the first year, but as the numbers began to grow, it became more difficult. So there were lots. So I would say the problems in the beginning were practical. And ideological, in that a lot of the Irish language families, the families who wanted to have their children brought up through Irish, it was a bit fitchy-foochy with Catholicism for them. Yeah. They did find it difficult to disentangle. Why would you have a Gael school, which wasn't a Catholic Gael school?
That's interesting. And what sort of ratio would you think in terms of the
I'd
parents?
say that was another issue. That was a big difference between what we had found. I would say about nearly 70 or 80% of them were looking for Catholic instruction.
Oh, were they? Really?
Yeah, as the reputation of the school improved, more people wanted their children to go there, but they were going because of the reputation of the school, not because of its multi-denominational or even Irish language ethos. They were thinking of it more as a good school.
Yeah.
And that happens in all our schools, except we would have had a better ratio, I think, because again, you see a lot of I'm thinking of the Cork School Project, which was the only other Educate Together school in Cork at the time. That when I went to the university, I realised it had the reputation of being the school for all these hippies and bohemians. And some of them would have been non-Irish. They genuinely would have been the kind of, what would you call them? Anti-nuclear war, people who had come from England, anti-nuclear, there was a whole movement in the 60s, you wouldn't remember.
New Age travellers.
Exactly. That's exactly what I mean.
They were all settled in
West
Skibbereen.
That's right. Yeah. Well, you would have had some, the less extreme of those would have been closer to Cork, and some of them were, it was the most compatible school for them. So that, I had my work cut out to try and persuade some of my colleagues in UCC who would have been very traditional, that this was a perfectly legitimate national school with a multi-denominational ethos, but in other ways it was a national school. And they'd be looking, and there was no uniform either, that was the other thing. And of course, so the kids were coming in from some of the less, traditional type families. So they did manage to get, Cork School Project would have had a better sort of religious, cultural, social mix, but a lot of them wouldn't be mainstream Irish, if you like. Yeah. So up in Gaelscoil and Gorthalling, we were getting a different demographic. Genuinely very good local people committed to the Irish language, but the multi-denominational thing was more difficult for them to grasp, because they would never, Mayfield area, they probably had virtually no Protestants, much less Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus or any of the mixtures we would have found in the other schools.
So it was a sort of core in that school who wanted that vision for it in terms of...
Owen O'Leary, the founder member, did. He totally did, yeah. So that was where that came from. And there was a core, the founder members were great. Yeah. And against all the odds, they got it started. But it's not accidental that there wasn't another one after that came in. I was also very keen to support them because of my interest in the Irish language. I was very keen to get rid, we would, as an Educate Together movement, get rid of the image as alien philosophies, was the word department people used to use. We were, like Michael Johnston he was Irish, came from a nationalist, but Protestant nationalist family. Like his father would have been a Protestant. Like he was the first person I saw who had the 1916 proclamation hanging up in his front hall. Like we didn't have that. So he, even though came from a Protestant background, he wasn't an ascendancy Protestant. Like, I don't know, many generations they would have been here. But
because he wasn't Catholic, there was this
exactly.
alien philosophy tag put on
and
him.
he and his wife had gone to school. See, a lot of that generation had gone to school in England.
Yeah.
They had gone to secondary school in England, and gone to university, or his wife did home economics, but in an English college. So a lot of our parents were from that background, and also the fact that they were in Dalkey, for example, they came from that tradition. They were very independent thinkers. They had no problem challenging their rector in the church. We would dream of challenging the priest. So they were very different culturally. Yeah. And I mean, that was a big difficulty for us. I wrote a little bit about it in the book, that for those of us who would have come from a culturally Catholic background, and I wasn't as rural as some of the others, they had a lot of difficulty with some of the cultural traditions that were inbuilt among the Dalkey Protestant community. We didn't have that at all in Gaelscoil and Gortaling, but as a result, the parents didn't actually see some of the Catholic traditions, preparing the children for First Communion, all of that. They couldn't even see that wasn't multi-denominational, because they didn't know anything.
Right.
And that's not a criticism of them, but it's simply, if you had 80% of them coming from that background, a handful who ideologically understood what was going on, but still came from a Catholic background. I doubt if we had anybody who came from a Protestant background, or any background other than a Catholic background, cultural background, I mean, some of them would not any longer be practicing Catholics. Some of them would be avowedly atheist, but they were still perceived as, Catholics. We know who you are.
Yeah.
So there was that issue, and it did make it difficult, more difficult to get an ethos that was visibly inclusive.
Right.
But in spite of it all, they managed. The principal. Oh God, I can't remember. I'll think of his name in a minute. Anyway, he understood the ethos totally, so he really got it. But then his Irish would probably not be as good as I would have liked. As we would have wished. As maybe Owen would have wished.
Yeah,
so we were kind of caught there between getting the balance between the Irish language commitment, the culture. Like, personally, I was able to straddle the two sides because I was brought up to Áine Hyland in a very committed culturally Irish environment. But that wouldn't have been typical, and I wouldn't have been multi-denominational except for my husband. I have a sister and none. I have 3 sisters who were principals of very Catholic schools. I'm the only one of the family that would have gone the other way.
Right.
So it's very different. It's still a challenge. Like, apart from Gaelscoil and Gortaling, we've never gone down the road of having an all-Irish educate together school. And in some of the schools, the Irish was not so good. That was one of my disappointments as the years went on. There are 95 national schools now. Some of them are great. Their Irish is great, but some of them are still, their Irish wouldn't be as good as I'd wish to see it.
And just in terms of we might talk about that, how Educate Together developed a bit later, but just in terms of on Gortaling and still, that core, was that part of the core who were looking to
set it up?
Yeah, and this sort of vision of a multi-denominational thing, in terms of the context, was that part of something that was changing then in the 90s, or this rejection of...
Yeah, I think it was. It was the beginning of autonomy of a population that didn't want to be spoken at and spoken to by the church, and that the church would speak on their behalf. They wanted to speak on their own behalf, and of course, that was the big difference. And a lot of the Gaeilge, the Irish language people, they were autonomous, independent people who had thought through why they were involved, and they were, and of course, you would also have a tradition in some parishes of some of the priests almost being anti-Irish, you know, and that didn't help the Irish language movement. I mean, I was baptised as Anne because, and all my brothers and sisters in the 40s, we were all, the parish priest refused to baptise us in our Irish names because they were still imbued with British ideology. So, I mean, that kind of thinking would have turned off a lot of families, you know, and decided them that they wanted to be independent and to have their own voice. And I think that would have been, and that became stronger in the 90s, of course, much stronger. And once they saw other schools managing to set up separately and independently of the churches, that Irish language core group in Mayfield saw no reason why they wouldn't do it. And as I say, on First Patronate, they hadn't yet. I don't think it had been set up yet. I don't know what year on First Patronate.
96, I think
it
was.
You see, and this is 93. Because I'm trying to remember my memory is I was in touch with Jacqueline around that time, but I'm not sure, was she involved or how did I know her? I can't remember. But yes, you're right. But I was anxious after that because, as I say, as Educate Together developed, it was hard put to support the English language schools. It wouldn't have had the capacity to support Irish language schools, and I could see that was happening in Mayfield. Like, there was nobody there to give them the kind of support they needed. Like, I had been running summer courses, all voluntarily, of course, we were all doing this voluntarily, through the 80s on the ethos and the religious education core curriculum. I used to run them in Blackrock Teacher Centre and the teachers from the schools in Dublin, but we didn't have any resource. We got nothing at all. I mean, Educate Together, which did exist since 1984 as an organisation, we didn't get a penny from the department or anywhere else. It was only in the late 90s that they began to get that money. Yeah, so that was that. Now let me see, where have we got to now? The challenges. What were the challenges? Well, the ethos, as I say there, they were good challenges though, because we had good debates. The real challenges were fundraising, getting temporary premises, and getting resources Trevan Gaeilge for that's what I would have said. And the biggest advance made, well, I had huge admiration for them, I have to say. I was on from 93 to 96. Bill died in 1996, and they continued to have, like, as long as I was in Cork, I came back in 2005, they continued to have ongoing problems with temporary premises. That was so what advances were made? School grew in spite of it. Students came to it, they had good teachers. But the lack of support for resources must have been a very big one. I don't know how much you're getting that from other schools, you know.
Yeah, it was a sort of across the board. They wouldn't put the proper money into resources. Exactly, they didn't have any resources really. No, then we go on to the next page. Well, Gaelscoill didn't exist, and First Patronate didn't exist, so that doesn't count. Number 10. What kind of relationship did we have with the department and the minister? Well, funnily enough, personally, I had a reasonably good relationship with, it varied from time to time, but because, first of all, I knew them personally. I knew them like I would know anybody I worked with. And a number of them I had left, like a number of them had moved up the line, like they would have started like me as executive officer. I was an executive officer, but some of them were principal officers by now. Art Callan and their dead people are all dead now, but they, my relationship with them was quite good. But their rules were still, and their policies were still very tight. And the temporary premises, for example, and rents for temporary premises, the rules. It depended more on the ministers, I would say, and what ministers we had. Like, Mary O'Rourke was very supportive, I have to say, she was. After her, Niamh Bhránach was fine, she wasn't negative, she was a Labour minister, she was in the mid-90s, she was supportive. And some of them, they inched the rules forward to make it a little bit easier, to give us grants for the rent, to give us school transport, to
removed the requirement that we have a site. We used to have to buy the site ourselves at huge cost, but we had to buy the site in Dalkey. But on the other hand, they brought in rules, and this was a big one for the Gael Scoilna, about the numbers you had to get started. And they were quite significant. I think you had to have 20 in Ninon, in the 20 plus 20 in the Ninon or something. And so there were changes in policies over that period. There weren't the rules never changed in theory. The Real Law never changed, but the policies changed from time to time. Some of them helped us and some of them didn't. But I wouldn't say there was an ideological negativity. There was more a passivity on the part of the department. They let you at it unless you had a problem, and if you had a problem then you were on your own.
Right.
And we didn't have the support that the bigger sectors had. The Catholic schools had its own CPSMA, very good support. Oddly enough, we had some very good help from, I can't remember who was on the CPSMA at the time in the office there. Some of them were very helpful to us, and they would send us their policy documents and all of that. So we had quite a good...
Was that passivity sort of rooted in economics, do you think, or was it just bureaucracy?
It was the culture of the department. And like if you go back now, admittedly we're going back to the 50s and 60s, the then ministers were quite vocal about saying, what one minister said, my job is like that of a plumber. I have to keep the pipes clear, but I don't have to initiate anything. I just am like a plumber or a maintenance person. That was basically what he saw his role as. So in other words, they didn't see themselves, and even after investment in education, some of the senior civil servants were very passive.
No forward planning. There was
There was
lack
no
of
forward
forward
exactly.
planning. It's just sort of maintenance of the status quo.
Look at I don't know if you listened to the radio today and last night. I have a grandson with autism. There's been no planning for those
secondary schools.
And I was on a campaign 6 years ago. I went to, and I just sent it now to the As I Am guy. 6 years ago, I sent a document. I went in before the Oireachtas Committee, and I said there are 150 children. I personally, with my daughter and her husband, because my grandson couldn't get into any school for secondary, and we did a big campaign, got the numbers. Went out and literally went from special class to special class all over Dublin, sent them into the department to make plans, and they never did anything. So I have no sympathy for them, and it was the same with this. They never saw themselves. They were totally passive, but that was, and still is, part of the culture of the department. Now, I know they have a forward planning unit now, and they are more proactive in terms of getting places generally. But you know better than I do, when you talk to the forest, that does not include trying to identify the wishes of the parents as regards the Irish language. So it's that passivity, and it was very strong at that time. Like, you could do a lot of things. That was what I learned as well. You could, if you had the initiative yourself, they normally didn't stop you from doing things.
But you had to build a head of steam.
You had to build a head of steam.
Direct
and you had
at them.
Exactly, and if it cost money, you had to have the money, or it's some, but you had to do it yourself, exactly. So in that sense, they weren't obstructionist, but neither were, like, I'm trying to think now, if you were to ask me, did we have an inspection? Did we ever meet an inspector in Cork? I have no memory whatsoever of any, like, I think at the time, the early 90s, I'd say we were more trouble. I'd say the inspector's attitude was probably keep out of the way, don't get involved. That, like, he or she would feel, if there's no trouble, don't go there. But they certainly weren't helping, Whereas in Dalkey, in fairness, we had some very helpful inspectors at various times. I just don't know. It'd be worth asking that question. But we didn't have any trouble with the department, but neither, you see, because it was our role to get the temporary premises and the site, they didn't do anything for us. But that was typical. That was the norm.
And that probably goes back to the sort of philosophy of rationalising
It does.
things. That they don't want to
It goes back to
expand
the
the
philosophy.
system they want to maintain.
Yeah, it goes back to the philosophy of the system is an aided system. We simply aid. That's what the department would say. I mean, Dáil questions that's what they would answer. The national school system in Ireland is an aided system. It's not. It doesn't belong to the department. It belongs to the patrons of the schools. In other words, to the An Forest now, Educate Together or whatever. But it doesn't belong to the department. They will aid it, provided they meet all the regulations and the requirements.
That's a hangover then from
the 19th
century still.
That's right.
They're not viewing themselves as a secular body that actually runs it. They're just mediators.
No, they're still depending largely on voluntary effort to, as you can see it, just even now, to start a school, it still has to be voluntary effort. But that's part of the policies, not just the ethos, it's their policy.
Right.
Okay, now what else? What type of relationship did we have? We didn't have any problem. I mean, our first patronate that didn't exist. The Catholic Church, I had no relationship with them in Cork. Whether the school did or not, the principal probably had to have some involvement with them for the First Communion, so I don't know exactly how that worked in Cork. Protestant Church probably wasn't involved at all. You see, that would have been one of the difficulties too of being Irish speaking, that there'd be no tradition of Irish speaking Protestants in Cork generally. ETBs, we weren't involved with the ETBs or the then VEC, funnily enough, or other patrons. So there was just no relationship one way or the other. And the patronage ethos, as you say there, they did choose, but that would have been the founder members. They specifically chose an Educate Together ethos, even though that was not an easy thing for them to do. And they had to try and get the balance between the Gael movement and the Educate Together. And you'd have to ask Owen about that, but he certainly knew what he was doing and was very effective in doing that. Obviously, as far as I can see, they are still, I went on the website last night because I wasn't sure whether they'd gone for joint patronage in more recent years. But no, they're actually under the patronage of Educate Together now.
Are they?
Yeah, they seem to be, I asked them that, but they seem to be not on Forest Patronate, because on their website they have Ag Fowlam na Céile. That was the Educate Together motto, yeah. And there's no sign of on Forest Patronate.
Right.
So I think they are under which is surprising in a way, because Educate Together was not their original patron. They were their own patron originally, because Educate Together the department would not recognise Educate Together as a patron until 1997, I think. So they had to set up a limited company themselves to be their own patron. And Owen would have done all of that. And then by the time they decided to transfer to a bigger patronage body, they could have gone to An Forest, or they could have gone to Educate Together. So I'm interested that they are, as far as I can see, that they chose to go to Educate Together.
Yeah, I have to check that.
Check that.
Yeah.
But as far as I can see, there's nothing on their website at the moment that suggests that they are a school under An Forest Patronate. But they have the Educate Together logo and all of that. So.
And then the teachers' unions, did you have any?
We had no problem there by that stage. I'd had a lot of problems back in the 80s with the 70s rather, but by 1993 the problems were resolved. We were just trying to work out all that time panel rights. Panel rights were a problem, but they were a problem for Gaelscoill as well. So we were trying to figure out, and that's where Mary O'Rourke was very helpful. She genuinely tried to see how we could resolve that. How could you have panel rights when there was no other Gaelscoill? There was no other multi-denominational Gaelscoill. So which panel, the way the panel operates.
When there's a vacancy.
Yeah, exactly. So that if there is if a teacher becomes redundant, where does she have a right to be redeployed to? And I don't know who they are, what they have, what Mayfield have worked out. That would be an interesting one to ask them.
Yeah.
if that situation arises, where will their teachers be eligible for panel rights?
Yeah.
And I don't know, are they eligible geographically for any school in the area, or only for Educate Together schools, or only for Gaelscoilna, or any of them? I don't know. That's an interesting one.
It was based on the diocese at one time.
Yeah, that's right. They were all. See, that's why our teachers had, our early teachers had no panel rights, and I must say they were very courageous to take the jobs. They were very, very courageous. I mean, Jane Doran, who only retired a few years ago, and she still lives locally here, she left a Catholic national school. She was only 23 to 24 years of age. She left that school where she had panel rights, and she was in Tala, what was it called? She left that school to come to the Dorky School Project, and she lost her panel rights. And it was a huge risk, because we were the first school and anything could have happened. And she would have lost her job at a time when there weren't that many jobs. You know?
And being sort of blacklisted,
yeah,
basically.
Exactly. She was told she'd be blacklisted, exactly.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And then the politicians then...
I don't remember. I remember every detail of our situation up here, but I don't remember. I wouldn't have known. See, I only came to Cork then, so I wouldn't have known who the politicians. I don't know at all. But again, he'll tell you that. Oh no, he'll tell you that. I didn't know them at all. I knew them all up here, but we didn't have any difficulty either. And as far as I could see, as the years went on, they got support from local politicians to try and get temporary premises and things, and the GAA, as I say, helped them out as well. What understanding had you of all Irish schooling? Well, I had a good understanding, because like yourself, I had done my PhD and I understood the system very well, so I understood all of that. And I imagine so did Owen, because he knew exactly what he was doing. Like, he knew, so I think he understood the system very well. And of course, there was no all-Irish schooling in the 6 counties at the time, so we'd have had nothing there. And we were very aware of the problems of Northern Ireland, and the putting down of the Catholic community in the north, and the Irish language community. We would be very aware of that. But that was they were the bad times still up in the north, you know.
And the Gaeltacht then.
And yeah, I don't know. I had no contact, oddly enough, at any stage. You see, because of the way I was brought up with my family. Well, my father couldn't afford to send us to the Gaeltacht. None of us were ever in the Gaeltacht, so, which, as I say, was why I've already despised. We weren't true Gaels at all. But that was a financial issue. That had nothing to do with my father's lack of commitment to the language or to the Gaeltacht. Like, he had himself and my mother, before they got married, they'd been down in Ballyvourney and they'd been down in the various Munster Gaeltachts, but once they had 13 children, there's no Gaeltacht. Holidays,
And then even in...
93, did I know anything, 17, of the language? Yes, I did, because my father had done the Buntus Kaita, and I mentioned the work he had done, and he had gone. He was very interested in what was happening internationally. He had been to Wales. It was great. He was very impressed by what he saw in Wales. He wouldn't, French in Canada, I doubt it, but oddly enough, I think I mentioned it, he himself didn't go, because the department wouldn't pay for him to go to Morocco, but some of the others who had research money, Antar Coleman, went to Morocco to see how the French were speaking, were getting France. And where did my father, I found a letter on his papers, where did he want to go? Do you know where? I think it was Turkey. He got an invitation to speak at a conference in Turkey Turkey? It was some unusual country. And I found a letter back from the department, provided he took his own holidays and paid for it out of his own money, they wouldn't object. And he was working on the Irish language at the time.
Right.
So I was aware of what was happening, and the answer for me personally is 17, but it's not that relevant really, but partly because my interest is in education. Was the vision achieved? Number 18. Well, others are better for answering that than I would be. I think the school, in spite of everything, it is just extraordinary that it managed to survive. It had probably the worst conditions of the whole lot. We had all of our schools had very bad temporary premises conditions, but Gaelscoil and Gortolling, those bad physical conditions continued for much longer for them than for others. And I know why. It's just, the look at the draw in a way, what possibilities were available for them up in that area. Looking back on it, there should have been, but they got no help from the department. And Educate Together never was able to help. It had to be the local group because they never had any staff that could help them in those early years, And maybe they lost out. Maybe if they had been part of An First Patrúnachta later on. But I know that An First Patrúnachta, that their schools have also had the temporary premises problems. And a lot of them are like a decade or more in a temporary premises and prefabs, So, but I think as a school, its vision has been achieved.
And then moving into the 90s or the late 90s, I suppose there was an Education Act, and
I didn't keep in touch with Gaelscoil and Gortolling.
But even going into Educate Together then, and the growth of...
that certainly, from 1999 onwards, the department changed. Micheál Martin was great, I have to say. He was very committed to genuine equality. I mean, I'm not a political person, but he genuinely had a commitment. He had a commitment to social equality. He had a commitment to special needs. He had a commitment to inclusivity generally, and a genuine commitment. He's the best Taoiseach speaking Irish that we've had for years. He's very committed to the Irish language. He was an Irish teacher. He was a history teacher. I think he was an Irish teacher as well. So he is very committed. But 1999, they decided that the department would take a proactive role. Once they had agreed that there was to be a multi-denomination school or a Gaelscoil, they would be proactive in helping the school to find the temporary premises, and above all, they would find the site and build the school. You wouldn't have to have a local contribution. We had to buy a site. We had to pay 10% of the cost of building the school. That was a huge demand. It wouldn't have been possible on Gortolling. Mayfield would not have had the financial backing in that area to raise that kind of money, because it's a working class area. They wouldn't have been able to think. So at least that what would you call it, that prevention that was taken, that part of it improved after 1999. But there still remained an awful lot. And then, of course, how proactive is the department? Initially, it took them a long time to build up what they needed to build up, to go out and help the schools to find permanent premises. And I think, but they have in more recent years, but I would say only in the last decade, been really trying to help Gaelscoil and Gortolling to get a premises. But I'm only following that at a distance, so I don't know the detail of it.
And then what do you think about, say, the expansion of the Gaelscoil and Educate Together since the 90s?
Yeah, Maeve, my sister, who's principal of Closh, she's gone out here, so I know a fair amount now in recent times from her. See, and her grandchildren would like to go. She continued. She used Irish language. She brought up her children to Irish and her grandchildren, whereas I didn't, because my husband didn't really have enough Irish. But you see, the system the department has at the moment, it sounds okay, where they do a census. What do? They do a survey of the children, of the parents of the young children who are born in a physical area, in a catchment area, and they ask them what they want. But that doesn't give the kind of numbers very often that the department requires to set up a Gaelscoil. And I think they really have to rethink that. This is something, if you talk to Julian, Julian Spawn and Conan Gael. Yeah, if you talk to Julian, he'll talk to you about that, and any Gael Dachas, any of those will talk to you about that. I'm not as familiar with these, but I do know they are not getting Coram na Féin. They're not getting the schools they should be getting. Educate Together are, ironically, because especially, which is good, almost beyond the capability of Educate Together to support them. You know, there are 95 Educate Together schools, and I mean, in this area alone is fascinating, because when we said that 45 years ago, we carried out a survey. Bill, my late husband, sub rosa, he was in the department, but he was carrying out the survey as a parent, and we showed that there would be demand, not just for one school in this area, but for more. There are now 4 schools, 4 Educate Together schools. There's Sallynog and Killiney starting in September. There's Dunleary Educate Together School. There's Monkstown Educate Together School. There's Dalkey School Project. So there are 4. We always said there would be that demand, but at the same time there isn't. I don't think there's any Gael school apart. No, there isn't, because the only Gael school is still what do you call the one down in
Lorcan would be the closest, but they're looking for one in
exactly.
Dunleary,
And
Skull Lion, but
it.
they're not getting it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Skull Lion is in the Chinese shop. Chinese.
Is that where it is now?
Yeah, it's opposite. It's in Killadegrange, opposite. The department bought an old Chinese restaurant, and they set it up there opposite the Killadegrange shopping centre. But it's right on the road, and I don't think they have any playground. But yeah, now, but again, you know, we know there's a demand. I mean, Maeve would do anything to get her grandchildren. She has 2 little fellas, 3 and 2, to get them into Scoil Orcán, but they won't get in there, because they're not. You know, the department is creating catchment areas as well, as you know. So there has to be a different way. There has to be a link between the Irish language policy of the government and how the department works. It works in parallel, but not in collaboration with the other policies of the government, you know.
Right, that's the problem.
That is the problem, exactly.
And they've started to sort of taper off that exponential growth that was happening with the Gael school.
And that's exactly
since 2018.
Yeah, but they did the same with us. They did the same with us back in 19. See, remember, I keep pointing out to them, if they look back at the population demographic, it goes like this. It has gone like this. I started in the department nearly 60 years ago. That's how old I am. More than 60 years ago, 63 years ago. And I have followed the statistics ever since. And it is cyclical. So, but the department has never really learned that. They, you know, even when they have a forward planning unit, they only use the 4 years of the birth figures. Whereas we now have we have returned immigrants, we have huge immigration. We're going to have it again now, not just the Ukrainians. We'll have lots of them, and some of those will want second language. They'll want bilingual education, but the department doesn't seem to see that. They look very narrowly, because I was just reading some of their recent policies, and they're talking about the downturn in the population. And yeah, there will be a short-term downturn, but inevitably, much more sophisticated projections would show that downturn will become an upturn again, because the age group that is now coming into marriageable and childbearing age will produce more children. You know, all of these, they don't take that into account. And we had exactly that problem in the 80s when the papal visit, I don't know if you're aware of this, the biggest number of children ever born in Ireland, 74,000 were born 9 months after the papal visit.
79 or an 80.
79, 80. Yeah. Now we have, then it went down to 47,000 10, 15 years later. And in the late 80s, we really suffered from that, with the department saying we can't set up any more Educate Together schools because there's a surplus of schools in the country. At least now they look at the GPS figures for a location, so they're not looking as much at the bulk figures.
Statewide, just saying, well, there's too many of them.
Yeah, you can send them from Dublin to West Cork. Yeah, they know you can't do that, but they're still not really getting that those projections. They're getting the projections right, but they have to see farther than that, and they have to see. I don't know. It was well intentioned, the development of the department saying we're going to set out the catchment areas. We're then going to take a survey of the choices of parents. But if you go to the extreme of that, that's not the way to do it either, you know. There has to be something like, maybe in the longer term. I mean, I've been talking to the new the new head of Educate Together, Emer Nolan, who's very good. You know, maybe Educate Together's day, that they should now begin to work with the ETBs and the community national schools. Now, I know a lot of my colleagues won't agree with that, but the ETBs have so much money, so much backup, so much support, you know, and we have so little. And then maybe that the Irish language, the department should be looking at that totally separately in the and not, you know, in fairness, I was just looking at it this morning. The department has on there, if you ever want to see the growth of the different schools, ethos schools, they have, there have been no new Catholic schools in the last 10 years, basically.
Really? Yeah,
no, virtually none, no. Even though they still have 88.7% of the enrolment, but they're going down, and the multi-denominationals are going up. And virtually all the new schools of the last 10 years are either ETBs, community national schools, Educate Together schools, or Gael Scoilna. And, you know, I think it's totally time. I've been asked to do an article on, you know, the Forum on Patronage and Pluralism, if you read that. Did you ever read that one? That's worth... Now, 10 years ago, 2011, John Coulahan chaired a group for the department which looked at patronage of national schools for the coming decades. And he very well intentionally introduced the concept of divesting Catholic schools.
Oh, yeah, it's a very slow process.
It's
just
never going to happen.
Yeah.
Never going to happen. I said it to him at the time, and I'm a great admirer of John's. I said, John, it won't happen. You know, that's simply... It's asking turkeys to vote for Christmas, you know, it won't happen.
They did one out in Tallaght, school cat named Maud, I think,
Yeah,
divested, but there was an article on it in the journal, or Noteworthy, which was interesting, but just showed it's not happening really.
No.
It's that snail's pace, and
that's snail's
as you say,
pace.
they'll be going against their own interests.
Yeah, they're not
it's like the
yeah.
maternity hospital.
It's
thing,
very similar.
Same
very similar.
thing.
And their legal documents, they will fall back on the legal documents, which are very, you know, their ethos, and they're in trust in the what's it called? The Dublin Diocesan Trust owns those schools. The Dublin Diocesan Trust, you only have to look at the name of it, and it was set up as a trust to further, you know, Catholic ownership and so on. That's perfectly understandable. That was their choice. But the department, it's naive to think that they will be able to divest. They won't be able to divest. So they really, really need, and from my recent, I've been involved just very peripherally with Conor Gael, with Julian's, he has a bigger group of different people looking, Gael Dacus, COG, all of these groups. I mean, there are great people there with great ideas who really know what's, you know, we could come up with something new as a country to figure out how to ensure, like, it doesn't make sense not to have another Gael school in the Dún Laoghaire area.
Size of it now,
Huh?
the size of the place, like there's
and
new
the
apartments going
exactly,
up and everything.
exactly, and the demand. We know the demand is there, and so the policy is it's just not hitting the spot, and they need to get it right. And I would be even saying, as I said, maybe we shouldn't be having two different types of multi-denomination schools, the ETB, the community national schools, and Educate Together. Maybe, you know, I think by and large, well, it'll depend on individuals. It keeps going back to the individuals. There's a very good man now in the ETBI called Seamus Conboy. Have you come across Seamus?
Oh. What are the ETB? When did they emerge? So I'm not too clear on them.
The ETBs have existed since 1899, but they weren't called that. They're much more democratic, you see. That's in theory, what they're like county councils. They're an arm of each county council. That's what they were originally. They were an arm of each county council set up to look after education and training in the county council area. Then, of course, the county council's boundaries changed, and then in recent years, Then they became known as VECs, Vocational Education Committees. That was 1930. And then very recently, in 2000 something, they became known as ETBs, and they were amalgamated. There's 16 of them, and they're mostly 2 counties together. But they're still, their legal function is to look after education and training in that physical area. So you have Dublin Dunleary is one ETB. So there's a national body called ETBI, the ETBs of Ireland. In other words, they're the coordinate. It's like on First Patronic. They're the coordinating body for all of the 16 ETBs. In very recent years, the department decided that they changed the legislation. They used to be allowed to have anything to do with primary schools. Church objected, you see, years ago. But that has changed, and now they are allowed to be patrons of national schools. And in the beginning, when they started being patrons of national schools, I fought tooth and nail, because they were allegedly patrons of national schools, but they had agreed with the church that they would have a Catholic ethos. And that was not, in my view, acceptable. So I went out public and argued very strongly against them. But in the last 3 years, they have a new young man who is an education officer for them, and he has developed a whole new statement of ethos, and they have all accepted it. And it's almost identical to the Educate Together statement of ethos. And but also it's more democratic in a way, because there are, for an area, the members of an ETB board will be elected, like they're elected through the electoral system. So in theory, now traditionally, unfortunately, that tended to be very what's the word? No, corrupt isn't the right word, but there tended to be a lot of, exactly. But that's gone. I mean, in some of them, there's probably a bit of that still, but by and large, that has changed. And so we could be moving towards a much more sort of socially inclusive, democratic, local authority system. It could be the basis of something that would be closer to what you see internationally. In other words, a local education system.
Interesting. They tried to do that. That's why COG was founded, because in the 90s they tried to set up regional education boards, but it never passed. So
that's
that was a sort of decentralisation.
Right. They did. That's right. Yeah. I have a file on that. Yeah. But the church objected to that at the time. You see, that was the problem. When John Coolan was very good, he's dead now, he was a professor of education, but he was really very well in with the department. He did a lot of work for them. But he was also very keen on, and I was as well, except for my concern at that time that they might be infiltrated by conservative, groups. And I was anxious, like when Niamh Bernach was there, it was grand, because she, had a genuine Labour socialist, she understood the issues, and it wouldn't have happened. But then it depended on the minister. The danger was that if they were set up and they weren't set up transparently enough, with enough genuine democracy, you could get a different, an outcome that we didn't want, But now I'm more confident. I do think, as you say, the recent issue about the maternity hospital was, to me, fascinating. My husband would have loved it. He wouldn't believe it. He was dying. He said it'll never happen in your lifetime. He knew it hadn't happened in his lifetime, but it has happened. The people of Ireland have changed, and the people of Ireland, I think you could rely on the people of Ireland now. You see, remember even when Bill died in 1996, every ETB, as it is now, was chaired by a priest. Every one of them. They had been taken over, if you like, by the church. So they weren't, even though they were democratic, the people weren't that interested in them, and they didn't bother, with their with the structure of them. But now we're in a different Ireland now, and I think we could move finally towards what other countries have had for a long time, you know.
Proper secular system.
Yeah, we could, but
decentralised, more.
Yeah,
local.
I always say now that when we say, okay, we have 95 Educate Together schools, but if in 1974 when we started, if even if we left the Catholic schools as they were and the Church of Ireland schools, but if the department had said from now on, every school has to be an inclusive school, socially inclusive, like religiously inclusive, culturally inclusive, except that they would have their Gael Scoilna. But if they did that for the religious ethos, we would have probably up to 1,000. I'd say up to a third of the schools have been built since 1984. You know, or it's 45 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's never too late to start something different, even if you can't do anything about the schools that are already there and have a legal right to exist. And I think now is the time that they could do that, you know.
People would start shifting then, maybe. Or...
I think they would. I mean, for those who want to stay in Catholic schools, there are enough of Catholic schools. And I mean, what seems to be coming through since the department started doing the surveys, there hasn't been a demand for, in a new area where there's need for a new school. Not one of the surveys, as far as I can see, have come up looking for a strictly speaking Catholic national school. You know, it's either a Gael school or an Educate or a...
So there's not that sort of groundswell parental pressure for it anymore. It's just there and parents just go to it.
That's right. And the church itself isn't pushing for it. I mean, they don't want to lose their own schools, but they're not pushing for more schools. I mean, the Archbishop, not the current Archbishop, but the previous man, what was his name, Martin, he said himself that he believed there were too many Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of Dublin, and he was willing to hand over some of them, but he got caught up in legalities, and you know. So even if now, but I do think the department now should really, but Norma Foley won't do. She's not the right person. She's not the type of person who's going to do something dramatic, you know. But I do think the Gaels, well, I felt when I was involved with the secondary school curriculum debate, I felt there was a groundswell of support from the Oireachtas for the Gael Scoilna in a way that wouldn't have been true 20 years ago.
When was that? No. Yeah,
that was just recently.
Oh, was it? Yeah.
Now it was to do with just last October. Now it was to do with the fact that Julian Despawn, who's
the T1, T2,
T1 and T2, and he's very good. You see, he's a very good political sense, and I actually think now is the time to grasp the nettle, and to have the demand for Gael Scoilna separated out completely from the sort of the mainstream English, and let those who want English language education decide whether they want Catholic or multi-denominational, but that Gael Scoilna should be different. It should be a different group altogether, because obviously you can see it, like those surveys the department gets a lot of interest in Gael Scoilna, but they say it's not enough to justify.
So it's sort of denying the minority their rights then, because you're not a majority. You have to have minority rights. You're never going to have the numbers.
It shouldn't be like that for the language requests, you see. It's okay to have, I mean, I'm fully in favour of that for the Educate Together, obviously, for the multi-denominational thing, but it's different for Irish. You can't do that. So they need somebody with fresh thinking to come and re-look at that whole thing again. And maybe for, as I say, that group that Julian has brought together, they meet every 2 months, they have representatives of 13 different organisations, COG, Gael Dachas, you know, there was a whole range.
Gael School for All.
Yeah.
Gael School for All, they're called, I think, aren't they?
I don't know what they call it. Yeah. But that they should come up with a policy, because they understand the issues, and they should come up with a policy that fits with the government policy on Irish language on the one hand, but is also doable. Like that's where the Patronage and Pluralism report of 10 years ago, it was never a realistic option. As I say, I could see that from day one. But on the other hand, it was a move forward in that it was very slow, but it was recognising the need to do something.
You sort of planted a seed and
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
something,
But
even
then,
if it wasn't going to happen.
Like here am I, as I say, 45 or 50 years on, and you wonder how long will it take to seed won't be grown before I die, you know. And that's what you sort of say, you can't let things be that slow, especially when so many other things in the world are changing so fast, you know. And that's the problem with the department, is very, very slow.
It's inertia
very,
or something, is it?
Well, it's caution. I wouldn't say it's
more.
inertia.
Yeah.
They have some good individuals there, but I think there's a very strong cautious instinct, non-risk-taking, a non-risk-taking culture in the department. And I don't think it's inertia anymore, you know. Now they have a new Secretary General, but I don't know. Do you know anything about her, Bernie? I wonder how she Irish. She didn't come from the Department of Education. She came from the Department of Children. Bernie McNally is her name.
Right.
So she's just. Sean Fowlou had very good Irish. He was the Secretary General, and he had very good Irish. He was Northern. Did you know him at all?
No.
You should meet him.
I knew the name. I know the name.
Well, you should meet him. He's down in Maynooth now, apparently, in the university there.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You should, just in the context of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Because he's great. Yeah. He's a Northern. He's from Bangor, County Down. His father was from Kerry, and he went to Trinity, got a first class honours degree, and was a scholar in Trinity in Irish. Like, he was really, really good. But unfortunately, he didn't do much. Well, I shouldn't say he didn't do anything for the Irish language, but that wouldn't be true. He was always approachable for the Irish language, and he certainly had no difficulties with it, you know. But again, the ministers do count. Don't ever underestimate the significance of it. We found in the Educate Together movement, it was always ministers that broke the deadlock. When we had a deadlock, it was the ministers broke it, not the civil servants.
Yeah.
And that's and I think Julian is very aware of that these decisions are political decisions, and once the political decision is taken, the department comes on board and administers it. You know, they're not as good at initiating the new policies, but once a new policy is articulated by a minister and by government, the department is meticulous about putting it in. So, there you are.